Stop everything you think you know about global peace is a lie. World War III hasn't been announced because it doesn't need to be. It's already happening, not just with missiles, but with sanctions, currency wars, energy blackmail, from the trenches of Ukraine to the ticking flashpoint of Taiwan Strait, to the silent economic battlefield between United States and China. This is not just conflict, this is a global power reset. Empires don't fall in a single explosion, they collapse slowly, financially, strategically, silently, and right now we are watching the biggest power shift of the 21st century unfold in real time. The only question is, who wins? In the spring of 2025, a declaration was made, not with soldiers, not with missiles, with paper executive orders, tariff schedules, and the clinical language of economic warfare. Within 72 hours, the contours of global trade had shifted in ways that analysts are still working to fully measure. What looked to many observers like a confrontation turned out to be something more consequential, a detonator meeting a charge that had been laid years in advance. The question that matters is not what happened in those 72 hours. The question is what was already in place before the first order was signed. The executive order came with the full weight of American economic authority behind it. China was formally designated a strategic adversary, not merely a competitor, not a trade partner with grievances, but an adversary. The language was deliberate. It carried legal and institutional implications that cascaded immediately into policy. Tariffs were elevated to levels not seen in a century of modern trade. Financial restrictions followed. At the northern border, processing of Chinese-linked supply chains was slowed. At ports, scrutiny intensified. American markets reacted within hours. Equity indices fluctuated. Sectors dependent on cross-Pacific supply, consumer electronics, rare earth-reliant manufacturing, pharmaceutical inputs, absorbed the first shocks. Washington had moved with speed and force. The message, as intended, was unmistakable. The rules of engagement had changed. Inside the administration, confidence was high. The assumption, shared across much of Western financial media, was that China would feel the pressure quickly. That internal economic fragility would force a rapid recalibration. Negotiations, it was believed, would follow within days. There was a precedent for this reading. Previous rounds of tariff escalation had produced back-channel communications almost immediately. The silence that followed this time was interpreted through that same lens. 24 hours passed, then 36, then 38. No statement emerged from Beijing that could be read as distress. No emergency delegation was dispatched. The silence was real, and Washington read it as retreat, as the quiet of a nation absorbing a blow and preparing to negotiate from weakness. That reading was wrong. The silence was not retreat. It was the stillness of a system being activated. The first visible move came through an announcement that, on its surface, appeared bureaucratic. A series of long-term supply agreements for critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, rare earths, and several processing stage compounds essential to advanced battery production and defense. Electronics had been finalized with partner nations across Africa and Central Asia. The agreements were not new. The negotiations, it emerged, had been underway for the better part of a decade. What had changed was their formal ratification. 15-year frameworks, infrastructure commitments, processing facility investments that locked in extraction, refinement, and delivery pipelines over a timeframe that extended well beyond any single American administration. The strategic implication was structural. The United States had spent years warning of its dependence on Chinese processing of rare earth elements, not merely extraction, but the refinement stage that transforms raw material into usable industrial inputs. That dependence, carefully documented in government reports that circulated with little public attention, now became a lever, not wielded aggressively, simply activated. The agreements did not redirect materials away from the United States overnight. They established a framework that would make redirection easier, faster, and more permanent over time. The investment thesis had been placed long before the confrontation began. The second move followed within days. 5 nations representing a combined economic footprint that, by any reasonable measure, constituted a significant portion of the developing world's productive capacity, signed a formal compact, establishing coordinated economic frameworks, trade settlement mechanisms, investment corridors, a shared institutional structure with its own dispute resolution processes, its own developmental lending channels, and its own vision of integration that did not require Western institutional approval. The scale of population and productive labor involved was not trivial. Neither was the implied market size, but the most significant element was not the economics. It was the timing. The compact had been drafted before the confrontation. The confrontation had simply provided the political moment to sign it publicly, with cameras present and the symbolism undeniable. Washington had handed Beijing a stage, and Beijing had used it. The third move was the one that analysts focusing on trade numbers almost missed. Energy, the redirection of liquefied natural gas export agreements, the acceleration of pipeline negotiations, and the quiet advancement of port infrastructure designed to receive non-Western energy shipments. These were not emergency measures assembled in the heat of a crisis. They were the product of years of quiet infrastructure development, LNG terminals, overland pipeline agreements, the financial architecture to clear energy transactions in currencies other than the dollar. Each of these elements, taken individually, could be explained as routine development policy. Together, they constituted something else, an alternative energy and financial spine that could, over time, reduce exposure to dollar-denominated systems in ways that compounded with each passing year. Infrastructure, unlike tariffs, does not reverse easily. A tariff can be lifted with a signature. A pipeline cannot be unbuilt. A clearing system, once adopted by a sufficient number of institutions, develops its own momentum. The moves being made were not designed for this crisis. They were designed to survive beyond it, to compound regardless of what any future trade negotiation produced. This is the distinction that most real-time analysis failed to capture. There are two modes of strategic behavior. The first is reactive. It moves in response to external pressure. It measures success by how effectively it neutralizes a threat, and it returns to equilibrium as its goal. The second is structural. It uses external pressure as cover. It measures success by how much durable architecture it builds, and its goal is not equilibrium but transformation. One leader in this confrontation was operating in the first mode, the other was not reacting. He was activating. Warren Buffett once observed that the investor who prospers during a market crisis is rarely the one who made the best decision during the crisis. It is the one who made the right decisions years before, who built a position when no one was watching, and who needed only for volatility to reveal what was already true. The crisis does not create the advantage, it discloses it. What was happening in Beijing during the weeks and months prior to the executive order was not crisis preparation. It was the maturation of a long position built across multiple domains: mineral supply, institutional architecture, energy logistics, financial infrastructure that needed only a sufficiently dramatic external event to be formally activated. The structural consequences for the United States are not hypothetical. Defense supply chains that depend on rare earth processing capacity located outside American control do not become secure because a tariff has been imposed. They become more vulnerable because the tariff applies pressure without resolving the dependency. Advanced manufacturing, automotive, aerospace, consumer electronics that relies on mineral inputs now subject to redirected long-term agreements faces a timeline problem. The inputs may still flow today. The question is where they flow in 3 years, in 7 years, in 15. The energy dependencies of American allies in Europe and Asia, carefully managed through decades of integrated supply relationships, are now intersecting with an alternative infrastructure designed explicitly to offer a different arrangement. And the dollar's role in global settlement, never truly threatened by any single adversarial move, faces the gradual accumulation of alternatives that, over time, erode the structural privilege that underpins American financial power. Structural damage of this kind does not heal when the policy is reversed. This is the feature that most political commentary misses. The narrative of a trade war suggests that if tariffs are eventually lifted, the damage is undone. But the supply agreements signed during the confrontation do not expire when the tariffs are lifted. The institutional compact does not dissolve. The pipelines do not disassemble. The clearing systems do not shut down. The architecture remains quietly compounding long after the headlines have moved to other crises. We are watching, in real time, a demonstration of two competing governance models. One operates on the timescale of news cycles, responsive, aggressive, and oriented toward visible dominance. The other operates on the timescale of infrastructure, patient, structural, and oriented toward position. Neither is purely good or purely rational. Both carry their own risks and their own blind spots. But in this confrontation, one model produced a dramatic declaration followed by consequences it did not fully control. The other produced silence followed by architecture. The global order is not transformed in a single confrontation. It is transformed through the accumulation of durable structures that redirect the flow of energy, capital, materials, and institutional loyalty across years and decades. What the 72 hours revealed was not a winner or a loser in the conventional sense. It revealed which player was thinking in years and which was thinking in weeks. That asymmetry, more than any tariff schedule or executive order, is what the next decade of geopolitical analysis will be reckoning with.